The village of Little Hatherley presented itself to the casual observer with a decorous tranquility that had scarcely altered in the course of a century. Its streets, lined with neatly clipped hedgerows and brickwork brightened by the occasional climbing rose, held the promise of civility in almost every glance exchanged. Inspector Pewbright, whose reputation for noticing what others overlooked had preceded him even to this diminutive parish, arrived shortly before the Sunday service, ostensibly to observe the sermon, though in truth his interest lay in the undercurrents that often passed unnoticed beneath the surface of decorous routine. The church itself was modest, its stonework softened by ivy and the occasional lichen, and within its nave, pews had been polished to a subdued shine. Parishioners entered with the gentle air of habitual propriety, exchanging greetings that were neither warm nor cold, but occupied precisely the middle ground. Pewbright noted, without apparent scrutiny, the small cluster of churchwardens adjusting hymnals, straightening kneelers, and subtly correcting the seating arrangements of those whose posture threatened the congregation's symmetrical order. A glance from the inspector's steel-grey eyes was enough to make the more fidgety among them sit straighter. The parish newsletter, recently distributed, lay folded upon a bench. Its contents were innocuous in the main: a schedule of roof repairs, announcements of a forthcoming flower show, and a polite reminder that donations to the Sunday collection should be regular and decorously discreet. Yet Pewbright had long known that the mundane often concealed the significant. The notes in the margin of the newsletter, faintly inked and almost invisible, hinted at minor disputes over bell-ringing schedules, suggesting undercurrents of irritation that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Curious, he murmured to himself, though only just above a whisper, how much vigilance the ordinary mind will expend upon nothing. He had occasion to speak, politely, with the sacristan, a man of mild countenance and an apparent devotion to the unbroken regularity of his duties. The sacristan's responses, measured and cautious, betrayed a certain unease. Words like routine and customary were repeated, almost ritually, as though the recitation of propriety might stave off inquiry. Pewbright asked casually after the rector's health, framing the question in the least intrusive terms, and noted a fleeting hesitation, a subtle hitch in the man's otherwise impeccable deportment. "Past weeks he has been engaged," said the sacristan, adjusting his collar with precise care. Occupations of a private nature, one might say. The phrasing was elegant, yet it suggested more than it revealed. Pewbright did not press. To do so would have been inelegant and, he knew, likely counterproductive. Instead, he made a mental note of the unusual circumspection. Gossip, as always, circulated with perfect decorum. Mrs. Pembroke, whose bonnet was trimmed with modestly tasteful lace, mentioned in passing that a donation she had recently made to the parish had gone unacknowledged. Her words were phrased with polite irritation, a soft edge to the otherwise gentle tones of her conversation. Pewbright listened, noting the careful calibration of civility and grievance. Such small matters, he reflected, were rarely as innocuous as they seemed. In every complaint lay a seed of reputation's anxiety, and in every omission the potential for unspoken conflict. The priest himself arrived, unremarkable in his dress but conspicuously early, an anomaly given his recent pattern of delayed appearances. He greeted his parishioners with the precise mixture of warmth and restraint that bespoke both familiarity and authority. Pewbright observed him as one might observe a delicate mechanism, noting the measured cadence of his steps, the slight tension in his shoulders, and the faint creasing about his eyes, suggesting an inward attention to matters unspoken. The priest moved among the pews, offering nods and small acknowledgments, and yet he seemed to Pewbright curiously distant, his mind apparently engaged elsewhere. The service proceeded with conventional decorum, hymns intoned without passion but with solemnity, prayers articulated with formal grace, and the occasional whispered interchange that betrayed, ever so slightly, the divergences of opinion or habit among the congregants. Pewbright's attention, however, was drawn to a small detail. On a bench near the rear, a folded piece of paper had been left, its edges protruding with deliberate discretion. Its presence was scarcely noticeable to anyone else, yet it carried with it a quiet significance, a message, a note, or perhaps a reminder of obligations unfulfilled. The inspector made no immediate move to retrieve it. The observance alone was sufficient for now. After the service, as the congregation dispersed with murmured thanks and soft bows, Pewbright lingered in the vestibule, speaking in restrained tones with various parishioners. Each conversation was a study in civility and minor deception. Mr. Aldridge, chairman of the parish hall committee, spoke with exaggerated concern about roof repairs, while Mrs. Whitcomb, who had taken charge of the Sunday school, hinted obliquely at minor lapses in attendance without seeming to do so. Every remark, every subtle inflection, was a window into unspoken tensions. The carefully curated reputations that governed life in Little Hatherley. Pewbright's final conversation was with the rector's secretary, a woman whose politeness was precise, almost performative, and whose eyes occasionally darted to the vicarage door as if expecting a visitor or, perhaps, a revelation. She spoke in soft, formal phrases, carefully avoiding the disclosure of any matter that might reflect poorly on her employer. Yet in her careful avoidance, she inadvertently confirmed the rector's heightened preoccupation with parish records and committee affairs over the past fortnight. "Merely the diligence one expects," she said, with a faint, unintended quiver in her voice. "Though, of course, he has other concerns as well." Pewbright inclined his head, noting, without comment, the hesitation and the faint tremor that suggested more than mere diligence. A polite nod was exchanged, and he turned his attention to the vestibule once more, where the folded piece of paper still lay. Outside, the village appeared as tranquil as ever. Children trailed behind parents, their small voices a quiet counterpoint to the rustle of leaves in the gentle morning breeze. Shopkeepers arranged displays with the utmost care, and the postman, in a flourish of civility, delivered letters with a bow and an apology for any delay. Yet, for all its outward composure, the village had already spoken volumes to the careful observer. In small silences, in fleeting gestures, in the polite avoidance of direct scrutiny, the narrative of concern, caution, and minor anxiety was being whispered. Pewbright's gaze lingered on the vicarage, its windows reflecting the soft morning light. He had noted the rector's arrival, the unusual punctuality, the folded note, and the subtle unease of those around him. Each detail, he understood, was a thread, and the tapestry of village life, though ostensibly serene, contained imperfections in its weave. He did not yet know the precise pattern, but he was aware, with the certainty of long practice, that the threads were there to be traced. As he turned away from the church steps, Pewbright's eyes were drawn, almost instinctively, to the cryptic annotation in the church log, a small penciled note beside the date of the previous week's sermon. It read, in careful handwriting, "Visits postponed, uncertain." The words were innocuous in appearance, but to Pewbright they spoke of attention diverted, plans altered, and matters unspoken. A faint shadow of doubt settled in the inspector's mind. The village, so orderly and polite, was harboring questions that had yet to be asked, and truths that had yet to be revealed. And thus, the first day of observation closed, not with revelation or drama, but with the quiet awareness that the seemingly perfect veneer of Little Hatherley concealed small fissures of concern, small anxieties, and subtle secrets that only patience and attentiveness could uncover. Pewbright pocketed his notebook with the same methodical care that he had applied to the sermon, the note, and the observations of every parishioner. Somewhere in those fissures lay the first clue of significance, the silent thread that would guide his inquiry forward. The morning light in Little Hatherley revealed the village in its habitual order. Yet, as Publite soon observed, the appearance of order rarely coincided with the actuality of understanding. He began his inspection, as a detective might approach a careful chessboard, with attention to the smallest details, the precise alignment of shutters, the conscientious sweeping of thresholds, and the furtive glances exchanged by parishioners as if secrets could be observed through the very air. It was a village in which civility functioned as both mask and medium, and Publite, with his habitual patience, intended to note the points at which the mask faltered. His first destination was the vicarage, where a modest pile of unopened letters had been left upon the hall table. Their envelopes, neat and undisturbed, bore the seals of parishioners whose handwriting suggested equal measures of restraint and complaint. Publite examined them with the casual scrutiny of one inspecting artifacts. A letter from the flower show committee contained vague dissatisfaction over the timing of practice sessions. Another, from a retired schoolmistress, hinted that the rector's visits to parishioners were irregular and, perhaps, selectively attentive. The words were polite, but their subtext, as ever, required translation. He addressed the rector's secretary, a woman whose adherence to propriety seemed to preclude any conversation beyond what might be sanctioned by social convention. "Good morning, Miss Harrow," Publite said, inclining his head with deliberate formality. "I notice these letters remain unopened. Have they not been attended to?" She adjusted a pencil on her desk, smoothing its alignment with the precision of one accustomed to invisible oversight. "The rector has been occupied," she replied, voice even, though a subtle pause betrayed her own unease. "Some matters are more pressing than correspondence." Publite made no comment, merely filing the observation. Occupation, he knew, could signify diligence or avoidance. From the vicarage he took a brief circuit of the village, noting the gentle choreography of morning routines. Shopkeepers arranged wares with meticulous care. The baker's wife paused mid-sweep to nod in acknowledgement. Even the postman, whose rounds required no more than perfunctory accuracy, seemed attuned to the invisible social signals that governed Little Hatherley. The inspector's eyes, practiced in reading what others left unspoken, lingered on gestures that might escape less attentive observers. A slight hesitation in handing over coins, a repeated glance toward the vicarage. A throat cleared as if to preface some socially permissible confession. The village gossip, as ever, was subtle but effective. Mrs. Pembroke, recently mentioned as aggrieved over an unacknowledged donation, was observed conversing with Mr. Aldridge, chairman of the parish hall committee. Their words were courteous, punctuated by laughter that was almost imperceptibly strained. Publite overheard a remark, lightly uttered, about the rector's frequent consultations with certain parties, which seemed to carry the implication of selective interest in parish affairs. The inspector made a mental note, cataloguing each instance of polite discontent. By mid-morning, he returned to the vicarage, where Miss Harrow, as if anticipating his curiosity, presented a carefully folded envelope. "This arrived last evening," she said, offering it without emphasis. "It is marked confidential." Publite accepted it with a nod, noting the absence of flourishes or hesitation. Inside was a letter, concise and formal, from a parishioner whose concern was couched in layers of civility. It referenced a minor dispute over seating arrangements at the Sunday service, and alluded, without explicit accusation, to behavior on the part of the rector that might be construed as preferential. The phrasing was careful, almost evasive, yet it carried an unmistakable weight, a claim, however modest, that something in the parish's social equilibrium was amiss. He set the letter aside for later contemplation and requested permission to inspect the parish notice board. There he observed the usual announcements, a schedule for bell-ringing practice, reminders for charitable contributions, and notices of forthcoming committee meetings. Yet what drew his attention was not the content, but the omissions. Certain events, he noted, had been conspicuously absent from the board: the rector's private visits, meetings of the Historical Society, and consultations regarding parish finances. In Little Hatherley, absence could be as revealing as presence. Pewbright's subsequent inquiries took him to the post office, where he encountered Mr. Fenwick, the postmaster, who spoke with the civility expected of one in a position both visible and entrusted. Yet even in this careful fade, cracks appeared. "Letters for the vicarage," Pewbright began. "Do they arrive with regularity?" "Certainly, Inspector," Mr. Fenwick replied, polishing a stamp with ritual precision. "Though sometimes, well, some are delayed, though unintentionally. One cannot always account for circumstances beyond one's control." The hedged language suggested, in Pewbright's estimation, either meticulous truth or deliberate obfuscation. In such matters, experience dictated a presumption of the latter until proven otherwise. Later he paid a brief call upon Mrs. Whitcomb, who supervised the Sunday school. Her tea was prepared with precise orderliness, cups aligned, teaspoons placed parallel, and the faint scent of lavender in the air. Conversation turned, inevitably, to the rector's attentions to the younger parishioners. She spoke with the utmost formality, noting the rector's interest in their moral and intellectual development. Yet Pewbright detected in her phrasing a subtle anxiety, a desire to emphasize propriety, while simultaneously hinting at minor irregularities that might otherwise have been overlooked. "He has been thorough," she said, eyes lowered, "in matters concerning their instruction. But of course all within reason and propriety." Pewbright inclined his head, registering the hesitation, and remarked, gently, "And is it always possible to ascertain the bounds of propriety?" Mrs. Whitcomb's lips twitched in the barest semblance of a smile. "One does one's best," she replied, and the words contained as much admission as denial. The inspector's next steps led him to the parish hall, where a meeting of the Historical Society was in progress. Members greeted him with reserved enthusiasm, their civility masking, as he had anticipated, a quiet defensiveness. Discussion revolved around cataloguing archival material, yet beneath the surface, he detected a pattern of omissions and selective reporting. Certain parish events had been recorded in meticulous detail, while others, most notably involving the rector's attendance, were conspicuously absent. Pewbright asked a seemingly innocuous question regarding the scheduling of committee visits. The chairman, Mr. Aldridge, responded with the civility expected of his office, yet a brief flicker of annoyance passed across his expression, unnoticed by all but the most attentive observer. "Scheduling, Inspector, is always a matter of practicality," he said, voice measured, though the slight tightening about his mouth suggested otherwise. "We do our utmost to maintain order, though, well, unforeseen circumstances arise." Pewbright made no further comment, merely noting the incongruence between words and expression. Order, he had long learned, was often preserved in the appearance of control rather than its reality. By mid-afternoon, the inspector returned once more to the vicarage. The rectory garden was immaculately kept, the flower beds aligned with a precision that belied human tendency toward disorder. Miss Harrow appeared at the doorway, holding a small notebook, and offered it without preamble. "This was left in the rector's study," she said softly. "Perhaps it may be of interest." Pewbright opened the notebook and noted a series of entries, dates and brief notes concerning parish visits, committee meetings, and conversations with parishioners. Most were mundane, yet one entry caught his attention. It referred to a meeting with a parishioner who, by all previous accounts, should have been unavailable. The phrasing was deliberately neutral, but the choice of words, "discussion held, uncertain outcome," suggested an inconclusiveness that might conceal more than it revealed. He closed the notebook with the same deliberate care he had used throughout the day. It was, in his estimation, the first tangible clue of significance, a subtle deviation from routine that hinted at hidden concerns, private anxieties, and questions left unasked. The village, so careful to preserve its appearance of decorum, was already beginning to reveal its fissures. As he stepped onto the cobbled street, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows, Pewbright observed the habitual gestures of civility once more. A mother adjusting her child's hat, a shopkeeper bowing as he passed a customer, and the postman pausing to tie his shoe before continuing his rounds. Each action was as precise as it was ordinary. Yet, to the trained eye, each contained nuance, hesitation, over-attention, and the faint pressure of conscience. The inspector paused at the corner of the high street, allowing the quiet to register. The letter, the notebook, the vague allusions from parishioners, all were threads that might in time reveal the undercurrents of concern that lay beneath the village's meticulous exterior. And though no drama had yet unfolded, no accusation been made, Pewbright sensed the first stirrings of complexity, the beginnings of a pattern in which reputations were guarded, observations were circumspect, and truths existed in half-light, awaiting discovery. A faint movement at the vicarage window drew his attention, a figure turning toward him and quickly looking away. No words were spoken, no expression was registered, yet the brief gesture carried significance enough. The day had provided details, observations, and hints, but this silent action, this subtle acknowledgement or evasion, suggested that the parish's secrets were not yet content to remain hidden. Pewbright continued his slow walk down the high street, notebook in hand, mind attentive to each gesture, each inflection, each shadow. The village appeared serene, but he knew better. The quiet surface had begun to ripple, and beneath it questions were forming, waiting for the proper moment to reveal themselves. Morning in Little Hatherley possessed a rhythm all its own. The careful scraping of broom bristles along cobbles, the soft creak of shutters opening, and the occasional cough or cough-like clearance of throat, signaling readiness to participate in the day's habitual exercises of civility. Inspector Pewbright walked these streets with the precision of a man measuring invisible tensions, noting the manner in which gestures, however slight, betrayed the preoccupations of those who, by intent or habit, wished them concealed. The village appeared orderly, but experience had long taught him that the appearance of order was often maintained by equal measures of suppression and calculation. He began his morning calls with Mr. Aldridge, chairman of the parish hall committee, whose house overlooked the central square with a commanding yet inoffensive view. Mr. Aldridge received him in a sitting room carefully arranged to suggest both comfort and discipline. Tea was poured into cups aligned with scrupulous exactness, and the conversation, like the furnishings, was highly structured, neither warm nor cold. It existed precisely in the polite middle ground. "Inspector," Mr. Aldridge began, settling into his armchair with the faintest arch of expectation, "what news from the vicarage? I trust the rector's affairs occupy him as they should?" Pewbright inclined his head. "Observations are preliminary, sir, yet one perceives, even at this early stage, that certain concerns merit attention." The chairman's thin lips tightened imperceptibly, and he shifted slightly, as though to reposition both body and reputation. "Of course," he said, lightly, "one must always exercise vigilance, especially in matters pertaining to committees." The subtle insistence on duty suggested, to Pewbright's practiced eye, more than mere conscientiousness. He noted the man's neatness of dress, the careful alignment of his spectacles, and the faint crease that betrayed attention to minor irritations suppressed. Each indication, combined with the phrasing of his speech, pointed to a mind accustomed to balancing obligation with delicate self-interest. Next, Pewbright called upon Mrs. Whitcomb, the Sunday school supervisor, whose tea room presented a tableau of precise domesticity. Napkins were folded with exact symmetry, the silver gleamed, and the teapot rested upon a doily free of wrinkle or stain. She spoke of the rector's attentions to her charges with apparent pride. Yet every sentence carried the faint echo of apprehension, concern over propriety, concern over observation, concern over consequences. "He has been attentive," she said, eyes lowered, voice measured, though one must always guard against excess in either direction. Not too lenient, not too strict. One does one's best. Pewbright's response was a mild, almost rhetorical query, and is the best always sufficient to satisfy expectations? Her lips curved with the barest trace of tension, a smile more implied than expressed. "We do hope so," she murmured, and Pewbright recorded the understated admission as significant, a polite acknowledgement that standards, however aspirational, were rarely met without contention. His next visits took him beyond domestic interiors into the communal spaces of the village. At the post office, Mr. Prauplake Fenwick greeted him with the customary civility, polishing a stamp as though ceremony could lend virtue to the otherwise mundane task. Pewbright inquired after the frequency and timeliness of correspondence to the vicarage. "All arrive, Inspector, though there are occasional variations," Fenwick said carefully. "Unforeseen circumstances, naturally, though one takes care that such matters remain minor." Pewbright observed a slight hesitation, the faintest imperceptible twitch, which he catalogued mentally. Even in the most trivial of professions, small deviations could suggest wider inconsistencies, delays, omissions, or the quiet concealment of attention where none ought to exist. At the grocer's he noted a different form of tension, the careful spacing of goods, the measured inquiries into the inspector's health, and a suggestion, lightly phrased, that the rector had requested unusual attention to the provision of supplies. The grocer's eyes, polite and watchful, flicked toward the vicarage as though seeking permission to comment, then returned to the task of folding paper bags. "It is nothing, of course," the grocer said, almost apologetically, but the rector seemed interested in the schedule of deliveries this past week. "An unusual request." Pewbright made no immediate remark. His manner, as ever, was quiet, his attention absorbing nuances that others barely noticed. The community, he knew, spoke more through omission and emphasis than through explicit statement. By midday he had returned to the vicarage, notebook in hand, to review his observations against the records now gradually becoming available. Miss Harrow offered him a polite, almost hesitant, commentary on the rector's recent movements. She noted, in language chosen for discretion, that he had been making frequent visits to certain parishioners, whose availability had not been otherwise recorded, and had left behind minor instructions for committee members, the precise nature of which she could only recall in fragments. Pewbright, making mental connections, realized that the rector's attentions were both selective and methodical, designed to preserve appearances while managing unseen concerns. The choice of whom to visit and when, the phrasing of notes left behind, and the timing of communications all suggested a pattern, a careful orchestration of influence, conducted beneath the veneer of ordinary duty. He spent the remainder of the morning in observation from discreet locations: the corner of the high street where the grocer's deliveries were received, the bench outside the church where parishioners paused briefly between errands, and the narrow lane leading to the post office. Each gesture, each glance, each slight adjustment of posture contributed to a tapestry of attention, obligation, and minor tension. During a brief pause at the churchyard, he noted a figure moving with deliberation toward the vicarage, the rector himself, apparently aware of the day's scrutiny, yet proceeding as though unobserved. The inspector's eyes followed the figure with the faintest hint of approval, noting how the rector's gait, posture, and attentiveness suggested both diligence and circumspection. Even in a village where every movement was, in principle, visible, the rector retained an ability to manage perceptions with elegance. Returning to the vicarage, Pewbright requested access to a series of parish records, attendance logs, minor committee minutes, and lists of charitable contributions. His attention focused not on the content itself, but on the patterns, omissions, and anomalies within them. One record, a log of visits to certain parishioners, contained a small annotation: postponed, subject to discretion. It was terse, seemingly trivial, yet to Pewbright it carried the weight of selective attention, an intentional deviation from routine that warranted scrutiny. He also noted the subtle interactions between Miss Harrow and various parishioners arriving for minor errands, the lowered gaze when she mentioned a name, the adjustment of a sleeve or collar, the soft clearing of a throat. Each gesture, small and almost imperceptible, hinted at awareness of something unspoken. The village, it seemed, was remarkably careful to preserve appearances, even when truth lay inconveniently across the path of propriety. Late in the morning, Pewbright paused for a brief walk along the high street, notebook under arm. Children played at a measured distance from their parents, shopkeepers continued the ritual of arranging displays, and the postman delivered letters with a bow and apology for any delay. Yet beneath the surface, the patterns he had observed, selective visits, postponed errands, subtle evasions, formed an invisible lattice, connecting actions, words, and gestures into a narrative only visible to one who sought it patiently. A final observation before his departure drew his attention. A parishioner, passing near the vicarage garden, paused as though to look at the inspector, then quickly diverted gaze. No acknowledgement was offered, no word exchanged, yet the moment carried significance. The village's careful choreography of civility had begun to falter, if only slightly, revealing fissures through which subtle truths might emerge. As Pewbright walked toward the vicarage gate for the last time that morning, he catalogued all that had been seen and heard: delayed letters, selective visits, hesitant gestures, and the unspoken weight of reputation. Nothing yet demanded explanation, and no overt conflict had arisen. Yet, in the combination of omission and nuance, in the careful choreography of attention and avoidance, he discerned the first pattern, a thread of concern, deliberate and understated, weaving through the life of little Hatherley. And somewhere within that measured lattice, he suspected, lay the first tangible clue, not a dramatic revelation, but a subtle divergence from routine, a hesitation in civility, a minor note in a log, or a glance that refused to meet his own. The village, so polite, so orderly, had begun to reveal its shadowed corners. Pewbright pocketed his notebook, nodded to Miss Harrow in acknowledgement of her quiet cooperation, and stepped onto the cobbled street. The sunlight, softened by the slow morning, fell upon the familiar fades. Yet the inspector knew that beneath their unremarkable surface, observation had already begun to discern the shape of things to come. The parish hall, though unassuming in its brick and timber exterior, carried with it the aura of minor ceremonial importance, and Inspector Pewbright approached it with the deliberate gravity such a place warranted. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of polished wood and aged paper, and the light, filtered through tall windows, lent a measured solemnity to the proceedings. Chairs were arranged around a large table, each in perfect alignment, the geometry of civility dictating the rhythm of conversation that was to follow. The committee members arrived in succession, greeting one another with precise courtesy. Mr. Aldridge, chairman, surveyed the room with the practiced air of one accustomed to minor authority. Mrs. Pembroke, her bonnet angled with exact care, adjusted her gloves with meticulous attention, and Mr. Thistleton, treasurer, settled his spectacles and shuffled papers as if to establish the primacy of order over debate. Each member, Pewbright noted, carried a posture that suggested both confidence and caution, as though every word might be scrutinized by unseen eyes. "Good morning, Inspector," Mr. Aldridge said, inclining his head with the faintest flourish. "We are grateful for your presence, though I trust you will forgive our modesty in formal procedure." Pewbright smiled slightly, an acknowledgement of decorum. "I assure you, the observation of procedure often proves as instructive as any overt incident," he replied, his tone measured, yet carrying the quiet weight of implication. The meeting began with the reading of minutes from the previous session, and it was immediately evident that the group's commitment to civility masked a lattice of subtle tensions. Disagreements over trivial expenditures, the precise scheduling of committee activities, and the distribution of responsibilities were couched in language of politeness. Yet each carefully chosen phrase hinted at unspoken contention. Mr. Thistleton, for instance, reported that the accounts for the recent charity event were essentially correct, a choice of words that conveyed both precision and guarded criticism. Mrs. Pembroke interjected with a mild correction regarding the allocation of refreshments, her phrasing as delicate as a lace handkerchief. I trust the figures, though accurate, reflect adequately the spirit of generosity which we all uphold. The question, though polite, suggested a measure of doubt concerning the integrity of the reported accounts. Pewbright observed the interplay with his usual attention, noting how the members' eyes, gestures, and slight adjustments betrayed the undercurrent of reputational anxiety. The chairman, in particular, maintained an air of impartial authority, yet his hands, folded with deliberate composure, twitched briefly when Mrs. Pembroke made her correction. Each subtle movement, each small emphasis, was a window into the balance of civility and concealed judgment that defined the committee's dynamics. Discussion moved to the matter of parish events, and here the moral subtleties of the group became more apparent. One member, Mr. Havisham, raised a question about the fairness of seating arrangements at the recent flower show, phrasing it as a gentle inquiry. Yet the tone, as Pewbright noted, carried the faintest edge of accusation, a suggestion that certain parishioners had received undue preference. The chairman responded with measured reassurance, emphasizing that all arrangements had been conducted with due regard for decorum. Yet even these words failed to mask the slight defensiveness in his posture. The flower show, of course, must maintain impartiality, Mr. Aldrich said. We cannot afford the appearance of favoritism, however unintended. Yet one hopes that civility guides judgment as much as regulation. A pause followed, weighted with the mutual acknowledgement that civility could only conceal so much. Pewbright made no remark, content to record the interplay between words, glances, and posture. In this village, the balance of reputation and social duty was a delicate instrument, maintained with care but prone to subtle dissonance. Mrs. Pembroke, whose attention to social proprieties often bordered on ritual, mentioned a minor incident involving the distribution of chairs for the committee meeting itself. Her phrasing was gentle, yet precise. I only wish that arrangements be observed with consistency. Otherwise, one risks the perception of neglect, which, though unintended, may reflect upon us all. Pewbright noted the double function of the comment, a correction on practical grounds, and a subtle reminder that lapses, however minor, affected communal standing. The inspector's attention shifted to Mr. Havisham, who had remained silent for much of the discussion. His fingers drummed lightly upon the table, a gesture of impatience restrained by propriety. When he finally spoke, it was to raise a question regarding the rector's recent schedule of parish visits. Phrased with careful neutrality, it has been brought to my attention that some visits may have been postponed. Naturally, circumstances intervene. Yet I wonder if discretion is consistently applied. The room responded with a mixture of acknowledgement and subtle tension. The chairman's jaw tightened ever so slightly, and Mrs. Pembroke's eyes flicked toward the treasurer with faint inquiry. The treasurer adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat, an almost imperceptible sign that the matter touched upon reputations rather than routine duties. Pewbright, noting each reaction, understood that the seemingly trivial question had penetrated deeper than any overt conflict could. A minor debate ensued over the wording of committee communications to parishioners. The members discussed, with painstaking precision, whether phrasing should emphasize gratitude, impartiality, or decorum, as if the very choice of words could safeguard moral standing. Pewbright observed the subtle hierarchy of influence, the chairman guiding content, Mrs. Pembroke ensuring social propriety, and Mr. Havisham testing boundaries with careful inquiries. Each contribution was delivered with polite restraint, yet each carried the potential to unsettle reputations if misinterpreted. At one point, a new item was introduced, the arrival of correspondence from a parishioner expressing concern over the rector's attentions to certain families. The envelope was passed across the table with the gravitas of a minor relic. Pewbright noted the faint stiffening of posture among all present as the letter was unfolded, and the careful, deliberate phrasing with which its contents were read aloud. The words themselves were innocuous, polite, measured, and restrained, but the implications, suggested through innuendo and selective emphasis, were substantial. The parishioner requests that visits be conducted without undue preference. Mr. Aldridge read, his voice steady yet precise. The concern is discretion in engagement, so as to maintain fairness. The meeting continued, now infused with the subtle pressure of reputational awareness. Observations of conduct became intertwined with moral scrutiny: who had arrived on time, who had taken notes, who had phrased questions with an edge of propriety. Pewbright catalogued each gesture, each adjustment, and each polite inflection with care, aware that the resolution of these subtleties would provide insight far beyond the ostensible matters of committee business. Toward the close of the meeting, Pewbright observed a quiet exchange between Mrs. Pembroke and the treasurer. Words were not fully audible, but a glance and a brief inclination of the head suggested consultation, agreement, or perhaps silent reproach. These were the signals of minor alliances, the undercurrents that directed attention away from the obvious and toward the socially delicate. As the members rose to depart, Pewbright noted that the letter, once read, had been folded and returned to the envelope with meticulous care. It was a gesture of civility, yes, but also of concealment. The content had been acknowledged, yet its potential to disturb reputations was carefully contained. The inspector made a mental note. The handling of correspondence in Little Hatherley was itself a matter of social strategy. The meeting concluded without overt resolution. Committee members left with polite bows and soft murmurs, each carrying the invisible weight of observation, judgment, and expectation. Pewbright lingered briefly, surveying the room with quiet attentiveness. The chairs, though vacant, seemed to retain the memory of gestures, positions, and nuances of posture. The hall itself, with its polished wood and disciplined geometry, bore silent witness to the interplay of civility and concealed tension that defined the village's moral landscape. Before departing, Pewbright retrieved the small annotation he had previously noted in the parish records, postponed, subject to discretion. He compared it against the committee discussion and found a subtle alignment. What had appeared at first a routine note now suggested a coordinated, though discreet, response to concern. The rector's attentions, committee oversight, and the parishioner's nuanced communication formed a lattice, delicate but precise, in which minor deviations carried disproportionate weight. As he stepped into the sunlight of the late afternoon, Pewbright sensed, with quiet satisfaction, that the day's observations had revealed the first tangible pattern of social interplay, the delicate choreography by which civility, suspicion, and reputation intersected. And yet, as he noticed a slight tremor in the treasurer's fingers as he stacked his papers, and the faint narrowing of Mrs. Pembroke's eyes as she glanced back toward the vicarage, Pewbright realized that the village still withheld some measure of its intentions. The day ended without drama or declaration, yet in the subtleties, the hesitant glance, the folded letter, the measured phrasing, there lay the faintest clue, a question, unspoken, hovering at the edge of civility. The village, so carefully maintained in appearance, had begun to reveal the fissures beneath, and Pewbright as ever would follow them patiently, noting the smallest deviations from routine, the quietest signs of unease, and the silent gestures that might in time disclose the hidden workings of Little Hatherley's moral landscape. The vicarage, in the soft warmth of early afternoon, was a study in domestic precision, each object positioned as if under the gaze of an invisible auditor. The air carried faint scents of lavender and wax polish, and the sunlight streaming through lace curtains cast muted patterns upon the polished floor. Inspector Pewbright entered with the same unhurried care he had brought to streets, shops, and committee halls, observing the nuances of posture, gesture, and decorum, as though each might reveal more than words ever could. Miss Harrow, the rector's secretary, greeted him with measured politeness, her expression a careful balance between welcome and discretion. She gestured toward the sitting room, where a small table was prepared for tea, and Pewbright noted the deliberate alignment of cups and saucers, the gentle creases in the linen, and the faintly formal arrangement of biscuits on a silver tray. It was a room prepared not merely for refreshment but for observation, a space where civility served both function and subtle scrutiny. "Inspector," she said, voice soft yet precise, "the rector is otherwise engaged, though he leaves instructions should your inquiries require attention." Pewbright inclined his head, acknowledging the courtesy. "I am here in any case to observe, Miss Harrow." Perhaps the smallest detail is as instructive as the largest. As they spoke, Mrs. Whitcomb arrived, escorted by her daughter. Their entrance was quiet yet deliberate, a polite acknowledgement of presence that avoided disruption. Conversation flowed with restraint, punctuated by the measured placement of teaspoons and the gentle pouring of tea. Pewbright observed the women's gestures, a slight stiffening of shoulders when the vicarage door creaked, the precise folding of napkins, the subtle adjustment of gloves. Each motion, though minor, indicated an awareness of observation, and perhaps a concern for propriety, exceeding ordinary civility. The discussion, initially directed toward the week's parish activities, gradually shifted to the rector's recent attentions to parishioners. Mrs. Whitcomb's words were carefully chosen. "He is attentive to the needs of families, Inspector. Yet, of course, one hopes the balance of discretion and duty is maintained." Her daughter nodded, adding, "We have noticed that certain visits are more carefully timed than others." Pewbright sipped his tea, noting the phrasing. Attention, discretion, balance, words that described both the rector's duties and the underlying social anxieties of the household. In Little Hatherley, he reflected, even the most mundane acts of kindness could be interpreted as a threat to reputation or propriety. Miss Harrow, who had resumed the alignment of sugar tongs, spoke briefly, offering a minor observation regarding correspondence. Some letters perhaps require clarification before the rector's attention, though the subjects are often matters of small significance. Her pause, a fraction longer than necessary, betrayed a subtle concern, and Pewbright catalogued it with quiet precision. The suggestion was not of negligence, but of the careful management of information, a skill crucial to maintaining social equilibrium. Tea proceeded in silence for a few moments, each participant absorbed in polite attentiveness. Pewbright's gaze lingered on the arrangement of chairs and the small, folded note placed beside the sugar bowl. The note bore no signature, yet its presence implied awareness, a reminder, a communication, or perhaps a signal of observation. He did not touch it, recognizing the significance of its deliberate placement. Mrs. Whitcomb resumed, this time with a gentle anecdote regarding a minor dispute over seating arrangements at the flower show. The story, though presented as humor, carried undertones of judgment and moral calibration. Who had been punctual, who had deferred, and who had subtly exceeded or neglected their duties. Each observation was a measure of the characters involved, and Pewbright noted, with quiet satisfaction, the precision of social calculation inherent in even the lightest tale. And of course, she concluded, one must hope that attention to duty never lapses, even in matters so seemingly trivial. Pewbright inclined his head. Indeed, small deviations, if repeated, often illuminate character more clearly than grand actions. Their conversation moved, almost imperceptibly, to the subject of parish records and committees. Mrs. Whitcomb mentioned that the rector had requested review of attendance logs and notes from recent meetings. The phrasing, careful as a diplomat's, suggested diligence, yet the choice of words, requested review rather than insisted or instructed, implied discretion in monitoring, a subtle guidance rather than imposition. Pewbright observed the exchange of glances between her and her daughter, a fleeting acknowledgement of minor unease, quickly concealed beneath smiles of decorum. Miss Harrow, having finished arranging the final teaspoon, spoke again. "The rector's concerns often relate to patterns rather than individuals," she said, voice neutral yet precise. "Yet some matters, perhaps, require observation beyond the ordinary routine." Her glance, deliberately unobtrusive, lingered upon Pewbright for a fraction of a second, an acknowledgement of subtle shared understanding. Pewbright made a quiet note of the phrasing, patterns, beyond routine, observation. Each word carried intention. In Little Hatherley, intentions were as significant as actions, and silence often spoke more loudly than conversation. A gentle knock at the door heralded the arrival of Mr. Thistleton, the treasurer, whose entrance was accompanied by the faint rustle of papers. He greeted the group with formal courtesy, acknowledging Pewbright with a brief inclination of the head. Conversation turned delicately toward the recent accounting of parish contributions. Mr. Thistleton's language was precise, almost ritualistic, yet in the careful balance of words there was subtle defensiveness, acknowledgement of accuracy, coupled with suggestion that discrepancies might arise from interpretation rather than error. Pewbright observed the interaction, noting the alignment of civility with understated caution. In the measured distribution of attention and language, he perceived the operation of both conscience and concern for reputation. Small missteps, or even minor omissions, carried consequences amplified by the quiet scrutiny of the village, and every participant seemed acutely aware of this reality. The conversation drifted to the rector's schedule. Miss Harrow mentioned, in softly modulated tones, that some visits had been postponed due to unforeseen circumstances. She phrased it with care: unforeseen circumstances, Inspector, though nothing beyond ordinary adjustment. Yet even in these words, Pewbright detected the faintest tremor of unease, a hint that postponement was selective, calculated, and observed. Mrs. Whitcomb, in agreement, added, "One trusts that such discretion serves both propriety and pastoral care." Her glance toward the inspector suggested recognition of an underlying question, unspoken but mutually understood. Pewbright allowed the observation to settle. In Little Hatherley, where appearance of propriety outweighed declaration of fact, even minor deviations from routine were significant. The selective scheduling, the phrasing of instructions, and the quiet management of letters were all pieces of a lattice of discretion that had yet to fully reveal its shape. As tea concluded, the group rose with precise gestures of acknowledgement and deference. Pewbright's gaze lingered on the folded note beside the sugar bowl. Its origin was unclear. Its purpose, unspoken. Yet its presence, in a setting so carefully ordered, suggested communication without declaration, observation without intrusion. It was, he reflected, the faintest nudge toward understanding that the vicarage itself was a locus of discretion and minor anxiety, a place where moral and social currents intersected beneath the surface of civility. Outside, the sun softened into the late afternoon. Pewbright noted a brief exchange of glances between Mrs. Whitcomb and her daughter as they returned to domestic tasks. A gesture that suggested minor apprehension, recognition, or calculation. The rector remained absent, yet his influence was palpably present, in gestures, in phrasing, in attention to detail, and in the quiet tensions that underscored even ordinary conversation. Pewbright walked slowly from the vicarage, notebook in hand. The village appeared unchanged, peaceful, and orderly. Yet beneath the surface, the day's observations had revealed a lattice of concern and discretion. Selective postponements, carefully managed correspondence, and silent signals of unease all hinted at a pattern yet to be fully understood. A single movement at a window caught his eye, a shadow passing quickly, deliberately avoiding observation. It was a gesture so slight that most would have dismissed it. Yet Pewbright, trained to read the faintest cues, recognized it as the outward sign of inward attention. Someone was watching, measuring, and perhaps testing the boundaries of what might be revealed. The day concluded, not with dramatic revelation, but with the faintest hint, a question hovering unspoken in the quiet interplay of gestures, notes, and deliberate observation. The village, so attentive to propriety, had begun to whisper its subtleties, and Inspector Poobright, with his habitual patience, would follow these faint signals with care. The lattice of discretion, concern, and moral vigilance was now visible, if only partially, and within it lay the first threads of understanding that would, in time, reveal the hidden shape of Little Hatherley's social and ethical landscape. The rector's study was a room of deliberate restraint, its furnishings minimal but precisely arranged, as if each item had been chosen not for comfort, but for the subtle orchestration of perception. Inspector Poobright entered with the quiet attentiveness he had maintained throughout his visits, noting first the absence of disorder, and then the faint traces of human presence, a slightly indented cushion on the chair, a pen laid obliquely across a sheet of paper, and the lingering scent of ink and polished wood. Every detail, he understood, was a signal, a minor deviation from the predictable rhythm of daily routine. Miss Harrow, who had accompanied him, gestured toward the desk with a cautious formality. "Inspector, the rector has left instructions regarding access to records. I trust this suffices for your observations." Her phrasing, carefully neutral, betrayed both diligence and subtle anxiety. She remained at the periphery, ready to intervene should any question threaten the boundaries of propriety. Poobright inclined his head. "Thank you, Miss Harrow. Observation often proves instructive in itself, even before inquiry begins." The desk contained a modest array of materials, parish ledgers, committee correspondence, and a small, leather-bound notebook. The ledgers were meticulous in their entries, yet a careful eye, Poobright's of course, discerned slight irregularities in spacing and notation. Certain contributions were recorded with precise amounts, while others, though present, lacked the customary annotation confirming acknowledgement. It was a subtle inconsistency, almost imperceptible to anyone not trained to interpret the silent language of social and administrative expectation. He examined the correspondence. Letters from parishioners bore the usual combinations of civility and suggestion, expressions of gratitude carefully balanced with minor critiques, requests couched in politeness, and hints of observation disguised as inquiry. One letter, in particular, caught his attention. Though outwardly formal and unremarkable, the phrasing contained a careful repetition of words, discretion, attention, equity, that suggested concern over selective engagement by the rector. Poobright noted, with a faint smile, how language in Little Hatherley could serve as both mask and mirror. Miss Harrow indicated a small, folded note, partially hidden beneath the ledger. Poobright unfolded it, revealing a terse instruction, written in the rector's neat, unembellished hand: "Postponed. Review in discretion. Notify as necessary." The words mirrored the annotations he had observed in parish records and committee minutes, forming a lattice of intentional ambiguity. Postponement, discretion, selective notification, these were not oversights, but deliberate calibrations of attention, managing perception as much as duty. As he considered the note, Poobright's gaze drifted toward the bookshelves lining the walls. Volumes of theology, local history, and moral philosophy stood in careful order, yet a slight misalignment, a single book protruding fractionally, suggested recent consultation. He retrieved it, a treatise on parish governance and the management of moral reputation. Its marginalia were subtle, consisting mainly of underlined phrases and short comments in pencil: balance perception, avoid offense, reputation preserved through discretion, and attention selective, observation necessary. These annotations confirmed what Poobright had already suspected. The rector's attentions were guided not only by duty, but by careful orchestration of social and moral perception. Each visit, each note, Each consultation formed part of a system designed to maintain both care and reputation, ensuring that minor deviations were managed before they could threaten the equilibrium of the parish. A soft knock at the door announced the arrival of Mr. Thistleton, the treasurer, who entered with meticulous courtesy. His eyes, briefly, flicked toward the open notebook and ledgers, registering interest without comment. He inquired about recent entries, phrasing questions in terms of arithmetic accuracy rather than social implication. Yet Pewbright observed the subtle tension in his fingers, the slight tightening of the jaw, as if awareness of oversight carried its own burden. "Entries are consistent, Mr. Thistleton," Pewbright said gently. "Those subtle deviations warrant careful attention, even if only to maintain confidence among those observing the parish." The treasurer nodded, acknowledging both statement and implication, and departed with the same formal civility that had accompanied his entrance. Pewbright returned to the study, noting the quiet stillness, the faint trace of footsteps on the polished floor, and the slight indentation on the rug where the rector had previously stood. A cabinet in the corner drew his attention next. Within it, folders of committee correspondence and minutes were arranged with care. Pewbright examined each folder in turn. He found subtle consistencies and inconsistencies. Some letters had been filed immediately, others delayed, annotations reflected selective acknowledgement, and certain pages contained marginal notes that suggested prior consultation, yet the recipients of those consultations were not immediately apparent. In some, the materials conveyed a deliberate management of attention and perception, a careful balancing of duty and reputation. He paused over one folder labeled Parish Visits, Special Consideration. The contents listed several parishioners whose visits had been postponed, with notes indicating alternative attention or observation. Each entry was concise, almost mechanical, yet the pattern of postponement aligned with prior observations, committee discussions, correspondence, and subtle comments from parishioners all reflected the rector's deliberate orchestration of engagement. Pewbright allowed a faint smile. In Little Hatherley, even minor administrative decisions carried social weight, and the rector had mastered the quiet art of balancing duty with reputation. Each postponed visit, each annotation, and each carefully crafted note was a thread in a web of discretion, one that both protected the parishioners and managed the potential exposure of minor anxieties. As he considered these matters, a movement at the window drew his attention. A shadow, brief and deliberate, passed across the glass. No word was spoken, no sound betrayed the presence of another observer. Yet Pewbright recognized in that slight motion the subtle acknowledgement of awareness, a quiet signal that observation was mutual, and that discretion was itself being monitored. He returned to the desk and reviewed the sequence of notes and ledgers once more, cataloguing the pattern of selective attention and managed perception. The connections between parish visits, committee discussions, and correspondence were now clear, yet the implications were not fully revealed. The lattice of discretion was visible, but the underlying motivation for certain omissions and delays remained a question, unspoken yet present. Before leaving the study, Pewbright made one final observation. A small, folded piece of paper tucked between two ledgers, partially obscured from casual inspection. Its handwriting was distinct from the rector's, precise yet unfamiliar. He did not open it immediately. Recognizing the significance of its concealment, the placement alone suggested an intention, communication without acknowledgement, presence without announcement. As he stepped from the study into the quiet afternoon of Little Hatherley, notebook in hand, Pewbright reflected on the day's observations. The rector's management of attention, the careful orchestration of visits, the subtleties of correspondence, and the placement of hidden notes all revealed a pattern of meticulous discretion. Yet the folded paper, unseen and unsigned, hinted at a layer of intervention or communication beyond the ordinary channels of propriety. The village, serene and orderly under the soft afternoon sun, remained outwardly unchanged, but the patterns of deferred attention, deliberate annotation, and silent observation suggested that beneath the polished surface lay questions unasked and influences unspoken. Pewbright, as always, would follow these quiet threads patiently, aware that in Little Hatherley, revelation arrived not with drama, but in subtle gestures, carefully calibrated omissions, and the faintest of signals. A shadow passed once more at the vicarage window as he walked down the cobbled lane. It was a gesture slight enough for anyone else to dismiss. Yet to Pewbright it signalled the beginning of a new thread, a subtle indication that the rector's discretion and the village's attentiveness were intertwined with matters yet to be fully disclosed. The village of Little Hatherley, mid-morning, was in its habitual state of decorous activity. Shop doors opened with quiet punctuality, the baker's wife adjusted aprons with minute attention, and the postman paused in mid-step as if to measure the exact propriety of each gesture. Inspector Pewbright walked these streets with the deliberate calm of one accustomed to observing undercurrents beneath polished surfaces. Today, his attention was on the parishioners themselves, the subtle distortions in behavior, the faint anxieties in posture, and the almost imperceptible hesitations in speech that suggested awareness of oversight. His first call was upon Mrs. Pembroke, whose bonnet was slightly askew, a detail she quickly corrected with a delicate hand, as if minor disorder might betray greater concerns. She welcomed him with a polite nod and a faint smile, which, to Pewbright's practiced eye, masked an immediate curiosity, not about the inspector himself, but about what he had observed, and what he might yet infer. "Inspector," she began, voice measured and courteous, "I trust your inquiries find the village in its usual good order?" Pewbright inclined his head. "Appearances are often more consistent than realities, Mrs. Pembroke. One finds value in examining the space between." The lady smiled faintly, perhaps uncertain whether to take the remark as compliment or admonition. She led him to the sitting room, where tea had been prepared with habitual precision, and offered a brief account of the past week's parish activities. Her words, though outwardly mundane, revealed careful attention to reputational detail: who had attended which meeting, the manner in which minor tasks had been performed, and the nuanced judgments applied to conduct that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. "It is a delicate balance," she remarked, adjusting her gloves to maintain both decorum and the appearance of diligence. One misstep, however small, might cast shadows beyond immediate concern. Pewbright nodded, recording silently the alignment between speech and gesture. In Little Hatherley, shadows were not cast by actions alone, but by perception, and perception demanded careful management. The conversation shifted to the rector, and here, as anticipated, subtle unease emerged. Mrs. Pembroke's eyes, though polite and steady, flicked toward the window and then the door, as if to ensure no unintended observation. She spoke of his visits with the cautious precision of one measuring propriety. "He is attentive to certain families. Selectively, one might say, though all within reason. One cannot fault discretion." Pewbright allowed a pause, noting the phrasing. Discretion, attention, selectivity, each word carried dual function, describing both fact and judgment. The careful alignment of vocabulary with posture suggested an acute awareness of social balance, and perhaps minor resentment disguised as civility. From Mrs. Pembroke's, Pewbright proceeded to Mr. Havisham, whose stooped shoulders suggested a man in perpetual negotiation with propriety itself. Conversation began with conventional civility, but Pewbright observed subtle cues, repeated adjustments of spectacles, fingers drumming lightly upon a chair arm, and a slight quickening of speech when the rector's schedule arose. "I have heard," Mr. Havisham began, phrasing with delicate caution, "that some visits were postponed recently." Naturally, one cannot question the rector's judgment, yet it is noticeable. Pewbright inclined his head, noting both the words and the hesitation within them. Noticeable, he understood, implied concern beyond mere observation. It carried a question, unspoken, regarding fairness and the allocation of attention. Mr. Havisham adjusted his papers, then added, with mild apology, "I merely report what has been remarked upon. It is not for me to evaluate, only to observe." The inspector smiled faintly, appreciating the subtle dance of indirect accusation and self-exoneration. In Little Hatherley, observation often served as a proxy for judgment, and judgment rarely appeared without caution. Midday found Pubrit at the parish square, where he observed interactions that, to the casual eye, would have seemed trivial. The polite distribution of letters, the alignment of garden chairs, and the measured nods exchanged among neighbors. Yet beneath these small acts lay a lattice of anxiety and scrutiny. He noted how Mrs. Whitcomb, supervising her charges in the Sunday school, paused frequently to adjust posture or glance at passing parishioners, how Mr. Thistleton, arranging parcels at the grocer's, maintained a vigilance that suggested minor apprehension, and how Miss Harrow lingered near the vicarage, eyes subtly tracing the comings and goings of all who passed. Pubrit paused briefly near the church steps. From this vantage, he could observe both the public and the semi-private, villagers walking in pairs, exchanging pleasantries with faintly veiled curiosity, and gestures that suggested knowledge unspoken. The lattice of observation extended outward, encompassing not only the rector and committees, but every interaction that might reflect upon the delicate balance of reputation. Later, he visited the post office, where Mr. Fenwick greeted him with polite attention, as though even the act of receipt and delivery was subject to scrutiny. Pubrit inquired about recent correspondence to the vicarage. "All arrives," Inspector Fenwick replied, adjusting a stamp with precise care, though some letters, well, timing may vary. Nothing deliberate, of course. One merely ensures proper handling. Pubrit observed the slight tremor in Fenwick's hands as he spoke. Even in the absence of overt conflict, the weight of reputation and potential misinterpretation left its mark. Timing, handling, and perception were as significant as any content, and the inspector catalogued this as another thread in the growing pattern of deferred attention and managed visibility. By late afternoon, he returned to the vicarage to review the small folded note he had discovered in the rector's study. Miss Harrow, aware of his intentions, allowed him to examine it privately. The note's handwriting, unfamiliar and precise, contained instructions of a minor nature, details of attendance, subtle adjustments to committee records, and phrasing designed to ensure that actions conformed to propriety without overtly drawing attention. Pubrit reflected on the note's implications. Its existence, concealed within otherwise ordinary records, indicated a network of communication operating beneath the public layer of parish routine. The village's careful observance of propriety was thus complemented by subtle internal management, messages, acknowledgements, and directives invisible to all but the most attentive observer. A movement at the window drew his attention. A shadow passed, deliberate yet brief, and Pubrit recognized the gesture as observation, rather than coincidence. Someone within the vicarage, or perhaps outside, was attuned to his presence and inquiry. The silent acknowledgement reinforced what he had suspected. Discretion was mutual, and the lattice of attention extended beyond the obvious participants to unseen actors whose influence remained to be determined. He replaced the note and made his way toward the garden. The flowers, trimmed with geometric precision, reflected the same care as correspondence, committee records, and daily routines. Pubrit paused to consider the pattern of social and moral orchestration. Selective attention, careful postponement, and managed observation combined to create a network in which deviation, however minor, carried significance. As he walked down the cobbled lane, the inspector catalogued all he had seen. Hesitations, glances, gestures, annotations, and folded notes. Each subtle signal reinforced the notion that in Little Hatherley, the maintenance of appearance and reputation was as laborious as any physical task, yet far less visible to the untrained eye. The lattice of influence and discretion had begun to reveal itself, thread by thread, and within it lay questions unasked and actions measured, awaiting further unraveling. A final, subtle signal caught his attention, the briefest flicker of movement behind a curtained window in the vicarage. No sound accompanied it. No face was revealed, yet to Pewbright, trained to read these quiet markers of awareness, it suggested both observation and caution, a silent question posed to him by the village itself. The day concluded, not with confrontation, but with quiet acknowledgement. The lattice of selective attention, reputational concern, and moral vigilance had been observed in its subtlety, and the unseen note, combined with the shadow at the window, hinted at yet deeper networks of influence and discretion. In Little Hatherley, nothing required declaration. Everything demanded perception. Little Hatherley's streets in mid-afternoon possessed a peculiar quality, the stillness of civility punctuated by small gestures that hinted at private unease. Inspector Pewbright walked with careful observation, notebook in hand, considering how the village, while outwardly orderly, concealed a lattice of attentions, omissions, and unspoken judgments. Today's purpose was to reconcile statements from parishioners with records in the rector's study, a task requiring both subtlety and patience. Discrepancies, however minor, often revealed the underlying tensions of social expectation. His first call was upon Mrs. Whitcomb, supervising her Sunday school children with careful diligence. The children, oblivious to adult nuance, played with quiet orderliness, yet the mother's eyes flicked occasionally toward Pewbright, as if measuring his observation. She greeted him with the politeness typical of Little Hatherley, though her words carried the faintest shadow of defensiveness. Inspector, the children have been occupied and attended as usual. Any suggestion otherwise would be unfortunate. Pewbright inclined his head. Observation seldom suggests, Mrs. Whitcomb. It notes, and occasionally questions what is not immediately apparent. Her lips pressed together slightly and she adjusted a ribbon at her wrist, a gesture of nervous propriety. Of course. One cannot be too careful in Little Hatherley. The conversation drifted to recent visits by the rector. Mrs. Whitcomb spoke with precise neutrality, yet Pewbright discerned subtle contradictions when compared with the records he had examined. She reported 3 visits on consecutive days, whereas the logs indicated a postponement on the second day. Her phrasing, emphasizing attentiveness and diligence, contrasted with the omission of the delay, suggesting an instinctive preservation of social harmony. Next, Pewbright visited Mr. Aldridge, chairman of the Parish Hall Committee. The house, as always, radiated careful control, furniture was aligned, books arranged alphabetically, and the air carried a faint trace of polished wood and varnish. Conversation opened with formal courtesy. "Inspector," Mr. Aldridge said, voice tempered by habitual prudence, "I trust your inquiries do not suggest impropriety among committee members. That would be regrettable." Pewbright responded with his habitual restraint. Observation is concerned less with judgment than with recording patterns of behavior. Yet patterns often illuminate discrepancies between intent and effect. The chairman led him through a review of committee activities. Here, discrepancies again surfaced. Reports of parish events, seating arrangements, and distribution of refreshments were largely accurate. Yet minor omissions and variations in record-keeping hinted at selective attention. Certain names, though present in logs, had been excluded from mentions in correspondence. Minor errors were rectified in a manner that suggested care more for appearances than for transparency. Mr. Aldridge's hands, folded on the table, twitched slightly as he responded to gentle questioning. "We endeavor to maintain consistency, Inspector," he said, the phrase carrying both assurance and subtle defensiveness. "Yet perfection in such matters is, aspirational rather than attainable. Pewbright noted the phrasing, the pause, the slight tightening of the jaw, a constellation of signals conveying the balance between duty and reputation. In Little Hatherley, moral lapses were rarely dramatic. They were tiny deviations, amplified by observation and interpreted through the lens of civility. His next observation point was the post office. Mr. Fenwick greeted him with habitual decorum, adjusting spectacles as if to emphasize impartiality. Correspondence to the vicarage was discussed with subtle emphasis on timing and handling. Pewbright noticed a slight tremor in Fenwick's hands when referencing letters marked urgent, and the inspector catalogued it as another indication that even minor administrative duties carried reputational weight. At the grocer's, the pattern persisted. Parcels, invoices, and deliveries were all conducted with careful attention, yet the placement of certain items and the phrasing of inquiries suggested an awareness of observation. Pewbright noted, for instance, how the clerk's response to questions about the rector's requests was measured, acknowledging duties performed while avoiding the disclosure of internal rationales. It was as though each person acted with the unspoken understanding that their actions were, if not observed, then potentially interpreted. Returning to the vicarage, Pewbright consulted again with Miss Harrow. She guided him to review the small, folded notes discovered in the rector's study. Each note contained careful instructions, minor adjustments to committee minutes, attendance lists, and parish visits. They aligned, subtly, with the discrepancies he had observed among parishioners' recollections and administrative logs. The notes functioned as corrective measures, preserving both procedure and perception, ensuring that omissions or delays would not disturb the equilibrium of social reputation. Yet one note differed. Its handwriting was unfamiliar, precise, and formal. The instructions, while minor in content, included explicit reference to selective observation. Certain parishioners were to be monitored for adherence to propriety, and adjustments made discreetly to prevent exposure of small lapses. Pewbright regarded the note thoughtfully. It suggested a hidden layer of oversight, one that operated beyond the rector's ordinary duties. As he examined the paper, a faint movement at the vicarage window caught his attention. The curtain shifted imperceptibly. A shadow flitted past. It was a gesture so slight that a casual observer would dismiss it, yet Pewbright recognized it as deliberate. Someone was aware of his presence, perhaps even his scrutiny. Observation, he noted, was itself observed. With this in mind, he returned to the parish square to observe interactions among villagers. Conversations, when not perfunctory, were carefully hedged. Compliments were balanced with cautious qualifications, and gestures of courtesy often carried hints of underlying judgment. The lattice of observation extended outward from the rector and his study to the committee, to parishioners, and to bystanders, a network of attention and anticipation in which deviation was noticed and subtle correction expected. He paused near the church steps, noting Mrs. Pembroke conversing with Mr. Havisham. Their discussion, polite yet deliberate, revolved around recent visits by the rector. Each word, each pause, was measured, slight corrections were offered as casual observations, and minor discrepancies were framed as matters of procedure rather than judgment. Yet Pewbright's keen eye discerned the tension between factual accuracy and social propriety, a tension that suggested concern over both oversight and the appearance of oversight. Late in the afternoon, he returned to the vicarage for final consultation. Miss Harrow guided him through the logs of postponed visits. The patterns were now clear. Selectivity, discretion, and careful adjustment of schedules were intentional, designed to maintain both moral and social equilibrium. Yet subtle contradictions between parishioners' statements and recorded observations persisted. A missed visit here, an unacknowledged letter there. The lattice of discretion had been revealed, but gaps remained, like small fissures in a well-maintained surface. Pewbright made one last observation before departing. the faintest impression of a footprint near the side door of the vicarage. It was subtle, partial, and easily overlooked, yet it suggested movement unseen by ordinary observation. Someone had been present, discreetly, while he examined the study and records, a silent participant in the lattice of oversight, whose role and intentions remained unknown. Walking back along the cobbled lanes of Little Hatherley, the inspector catalogued all he had observed: contradictions between parishioners' statements and official records, minor adjustments made by the rector or others, and the subtle presence of unseen observers. The network of attention, discretion, and moral vigilance was intricate, and within its pattern lay questions unspoken and intentions hidden. As he reached the corner of the square, a small child paused to watch him pass, fingers pressed to lips in imitation of adult discretion. The gesture, innocent yet uncanny in its reflection of adult caution, reminded Pewbright that observation extended beyond formal roles, encompassing even those too young to articulate propriety in words. The day concluded without declaration or confrontation, yet a single, small clue lingered in his mind: the unfamiliar handwriting on the folded note, the shadow at the window, and the faint footprint near the side door. Each indicated a hidden layer of oversight, a participant operating beyond the ordinary lattice of parish management. In Little Hatherley, revelation arrived in gestures, omissions, and unspoken signals, and the inspector understood that the next step in understanding would require patience, subtlety, and careful attention to the silent, often invisible, currents of observation. By the 9th day of his inquiries, Inspector Pewbright had acquired the unremarked familiarity of a recurring presence. His figure, spare and unobtrusive, had become part of Little Hatherley's visual grammar, as neutral as the postbox or the war memorial. It was precisely this assimilation that now permitted him to observe a change in behavior, not dramatic, not overt, but perceptible to one trained to notice the smallest deviations from routine courtesy. He began the morning at the parish reading room, where the weekly newsletter lay neatly arranged on a side table. The Hatherley Chronicle was a modest production, printed on thin paper and composed with a scrupulous avoidance of opinion. Its language was inclusive, deferential, and reassuringly circular. Yet Pewbright noticed that the most recent edition included a brief amendment, tucked into the lower corner of the second page, a clarification regarding the postponement of certain pastoral visits, attributed to necessary administrative reconsideration. The phrasing was careful. No apology was offered, no explanation demanded. Still, the inclusion itself was notable. Little Hatherley did not as a rule explain itself unless explanation had become unavoidable. Mrs. Langridge, who oversaw the reading room with an air of dutiful stewardship, observed him reading with restrained alertness. It was thought prudent, she remarked lightly, to prevent misunderstanding. Misunderstanding is rarely prevented by explanation, Pewbright replied. It is merely redirected. She smiled, uncertain whether this was agreement or observation, and busied herself with straightening a stack of pamphlets already in perfect alignment. Later that morning, he attended a meeting of the Ladies' Benevolence Committee, at which his presence had been formally acknowledged but functionally ignored. The women spoke at length about allocation of funds, attendance at forthcoming fifths, and the correct tone for charitable correspondence. Their conversation was immaculate in its civility. Yet Pewbright observed the careful avoidance of certain names, the repetition of others, and the faint tightening of voices when the rector's recent absence from committee functions was mentioned. Mrs. Pembroke, presiding, summarized the matter with precise neutrality. The rector's schedule, as we understand it, has required temporary adjustment. It is not our role to speculate. No one speculated, but the silence that followed was weighted with shared awareness. The omission had been collectively noted, collectively agreed upon, and collectively sealed. After the meeting, Miss Harrow approached Pewbright with a measured expression. There has been some concern, she said, that your continued presence may invite interpretation. Interpretation, Pewbright replied, is inevitable. Silence merely determines its direction. She inclined her head, conceding the point without embracing it. His afternoon was spent calling upon those parishioners whose names had appeared most frequently in both records and omission. Mr. Havisham received him with studied warmth, and spoke at length about parish unity, his language marked by a faint urgency. He praised the rector's discretion repeatedly, as though repetition itself might serve as proof. It would be unfortunate, he said carefully, if well-intentioned adjustments were construed as irregularities. Unfortunate events, Pewbright observed, are often distinguished less by their nature than by who notices them. Mr. Havisham nodded, perhaps too quickly. At Mrs. Whitcomb's home, the atmosphere was one of polite fatigue. She spoke freely about schedules and obligations, yet each reference to the rector was accompanied by a subtle deflection, his diligence affirmed, his absence rationalized, his authority preserved through explanation rather than evidence. I am sure, she said, that any delays were necessary. Necessary to whom? Pewbright asked mildly. She paused, smoothing her apron. To the proper functioning of things. It was a phrase he had heard before, in various forms. The proper functioning of things was the village's most versatile justification. By late afternoon, Pewbright returned to the vicarage, where Miss Harrow had arranged access to additional correspondence. Among the papers was a draft letter, never sent, addressed to the diocesan office. Its language was formal, restrained, and curiously tentative. It referenced internal considerations and local sensitivities, and proposed no action, only awareness. The letter bore no signature. Pewbright studied it with interest. Drafts, he knew, often revealed more than final versions. They recorded hesitation, internal debate, and the point at which a decision had not yet been made. That the letter had remained unsent suggested either resolution or intervention. As he returned the papers, Miss Harrow watched him with composed attentiveness. It was thought best, she said, not to burden external authorities with matters that could be resolved locally. Resolution, Pewbright replied, is not always synonymous with clarity. She said nothing. The day's final observation came as he walked through the churchyard at dusk. The grounds were immaculate, the gravestones evenly spaced and attentively maintained. Near the rector's plot he noticed fresh soil, carefully levelled. No marker indicated recent work, and the groundskeeper, when asked, professed ignorance. It must have been done quietly, the man said, perhaps at instruction. From whom? Pewbright asked. The groundskeeper hesitated. I couldn't say. Instructions are sometimes implied. Pewbright thanked him and continued on. As evening settled, the village lights came on with habitual punctuality. Curtains were drawn, doors closed, and the day's conversations retreated into private reflection. Yet Pewbright sensed a subtle alteration in the village's atmosphere. Politeness remained intact, but beneath it lay a faint strain, as though too many adjustments had been made too quickly. Before retiring, he reviewed his notes. Patterns had emerged: selective explanation, coordinated omission, and a collective effort to preserve reputational equilibrium. Yet one element remained unresolved: the unsent letter. The unfamiliar handwriting, the quiet intervention that had redirected scrutiny without eliminating it. As he closed his notebook, a question presented itself, not forcefully, but persistently. In Little Hatherley, who had decided that silence was preferable to disclosure? The answer, he suspected, would not announce itself. It would reveal itself in timing, in phrasing, in the next small deviation from routine. And it would do so only when the village believed itself once again unobserved. The conclusion of Inspector Pewbright's stay in Little Hatherley did not announce itself. No meeting had been convened, no clarification issued, and no formal expression of relief or concern circulated among the parish committees. Instead, The village adjusted itself with the quiet efficiency of habit, as though a minor draft had passed through, and the curtains required only the slightest realignment. Pewbright spent the morning reviewing what remained unexamined, which was considerably less than what remained unspoken. His room at the inn was orderly, his suitcase still unpacked. He had learned long ago that departures, like confessions, were often premature until the final inference had been properly weighed. Downstairs, the breakfast room was sparsely occupied. Mr. Fenwick sat at the corner table, reading the newspaper with exaggerated attentiveness. He acknowledged the inspector with a courteous nod that lingered a fraction longer than necessary. The nod was returned, equally measured. "The Chronicle has been quiet," Fenwick remarked, folding the paper with care. "That is generally a good sign." "Quiet," Pewbright replied, "is often the result of agreement rather than resolution." Fenwick smiled thinly, uncertain whether the remark constituted observation or warning. The inspector's final visit to the vicarage had been arranged with Miss Harrow the previous evening. She received him with the same calm propriety that had characterized her conduct throughout his inquiries. If she felt any personal anxiety at his presence, she did not permit it to disturb her manner. The rector's study was unchanged. The desk remained immaculate, the ledgers aligned, the shelves orderly to the point of mild reproach. Pewbright took his time, revisiting familiar objects without touching them, as though confirming that nothing had shifted during the night. "I understand," Miss Harrow said, standing at a respectful distance, "that you have completed your review." "I have completed my observations," Pewbright replied. "Whether they amount to a review is a matter of interpretation." She accepted this without comment. He asked, almost casually, about the unsent letter to the diocese. Miss Harrow paused. "It was considered," she said carefully, and then reconsidered. "By whom?" "By those responsible for maintaining harmony." It was an answer sufficiently vague to be accurate. Pewbright inclined his head. "And the additional notes?" he asked. "The ones not entered into the main record." Her expression did not change, but something in her posture tightened. A minute correction, quickly suppressed. "They were advisory," she said, "not official." "Advisory instructions," Pewbright observed, "often carry more authority than official ones." She did not disagree. They spoke briefly of the rector, whose absence had now been so thoroughly normalized that it no longer required explanation. His name was mentioned with respect, his discretion praised, his judgment defended in abstract terms. Nothing was said of the final confession that had given the case its private gravity. Nothing needed to be said. In Little Hatherley, silence had become the accepted custodian of moral complexity. Before leaving, Pewbright asked one final question, delivered without emphasis. "Who first suggested postponement?" Miss Harrow considered this. "No one suggested it," she said at last. "It was simply understood." He thanked her and took his leave. Outside, the village appeared unchanged. Shop windows reflected the pale light of late morning. The church bell marked the hour with gentle punctuality. Parishioners moved through their routines with renewed confidence, as though reassured that scrutiny, having passed through, had found nothing requiring public adjustment. Pewbright walked slowly toward the square, where Mrs. Pembroke was engaged in conversation with Mr. Aldridge. Their voices lowered slightly at his approach, then resumed at once, a gesture so precise in its politeness that it bordered on choreography. Mrs. Pembroke greeted him warmly. "Inspector, I trust your work has concluded satisfactorily." "Satisfactorily," he replied, "is a generous term. I would say it has concluded appropriately." Mr. Aldridge smiled. "We are grateful," he said, "that no unpleasantness was necessary." "Unpleasantness," Pewbright replied, "is often avoided by timely agreement." Both nodded, content with the formulation. As he continued on, he passed the churchyard once more. The fresh soil he had noticed the previous evening had been smoothed further, blended almost seamlessly with its surroundings. Whatever adjustment had been made was now complete, its presence rendered discreet by careful maintenance. At the edge of the village, he paused briefly and looked back. Little Hatherley presented itself as it always had, composed, respectable, and quietly vigilant. The parish committees would continue their work. The newsletters would maintain their reassuring tone. Records would remain accurate enough to discourage inquiry, flexible enough to accommodate necessity. What had occurred, the withheld letter, the redirected attention, the carefully managed silence, would not be recorded. It did not need to be. Its purpose had already been served. Pewbright understood, with a faint, private irony, that no formal conclusion would follow. There would be no charge, no censure, no acknowledgement of moral complexity beyond what the village had already absorbed and neutralized. Responsibility had been distributed so evenly that it belonged to no one in particular. At the station, as he waited for the afternoon train, he made one final note in his notebook. It was brief and unadorned. Outcome preserved. Cause unexamined by mutual consent. He closed the book and slipped it into his pocket. As the train arrived, a movement caught his eye, a familiar shadow at the edge of the platform, watching without approach. When he turned fully, it was gone. The train pulled away on time. Little Hatherley resumed its quiet, confident routine, satisfied that discretion had once again prevailed, and that whatever had been confessed had been, in the most practical sense, forgiven by being left unspoken.